It was a warm spring evening on April 8, 2008, when the Carter family's life on the tree-lined streets of Charleston, South Carolina, seemed like a picture of perfection. Their home, a grand colonial-style mansion on the prestigious Rutledge Avenue, was a symbol of status and success. Neighbors admired the impeccably maintained lawn, the shining black shutters, and the ivy that elegantly climbed the white brick facade. Every detail of the house spoke of wealth and stability, much like the Carter family's public image. But behind the gleaming windows and perfect landscaping, the reality was far from idyllic. Nia Carter, 37, appeared to live the dream. On the surface, she was the quintessential Southern housewife, polished, charming, and always well-dressed. She was often seen hosting charity events, leading the local women's groups, and maintaining the impeccable appearance of her home. Her neighbors would compliment her on her gracious hospitality and elegant style. But for those who looked closely, there were cracks in this carefully curated image. Nia spent long hours alone in the mansion, wandering through the grand hallways like a ghost in her own home. The isolation gnawed at her, feeding an emptiness that had been growing for years. Behind her composed exterior, Nia harbored a dark history that few knew about. She had come from a troubled past, one marked by unhealthy relationships and an obsessive nature that she had never truly escaped. The lavish life with Ethan offered her security but no emotional fulfillment. Her days became a cycle of meaningless activities, designed to maintain the image of a perfect wife, while deep inside she was haunted by her unresolved desires and inner turmoil. Ethan Carter, 53, was a highly successful attorney, known for his sharp mind and cool demeanor in the courtroom. However, his professional success came at the cost of his personal life. Ethan was emotionally distant, completely absorbed by his career. He left the house early in the morning and often returned late at night, spending more time in his office or on business trips than with his family. His relationship with Nia had grown cold, and the passion they once shared had faded into a daily routine of polite conversations and brief interactions. His focus was on maintaining their wealth and social status, leaving Nia to face the emotional void on her own. Their home, while grand and stately, felt empty. The long dining table where they used to share meals together had been left unused, as Ethan frequently worked late and Nia dined alone. The laughter and conversation that once filled the rooms had disappeared, replaced by silence and distance. But the perfect illusion was further shattered with the arrival of Jamison Carter. At 23, he was Ethan's son from his first marriage, a tall and athletic young man who had recently returned from his service in the Army. Jamison had always been distant from his father, growing up mostly with his mother after Ethan's first marriage ended. But after several years of drifting, Jamison moved back in with his father in early March 2008, hoping to find some direction in his life. Jamison's presence in the house immediately created tension. He was a stranger to Nia, and his relationship with Ethan was strained. They were two men who had never really known each other, and now they were forced to cohabit the same space. Jamison struggled to find his place in this world of privilege and wealth that felt foreign to him. He spent most of his days aimlessly around the house, trying to figure out his next steps, while Nia watched him from a distance, initially with curiosity and later with something far more dangerous. As spring unfolded, the tension in the Carter household simmered beneath the surface. Nia, lost in her emotional isolation, began to find herself inexplicably drawn to Jamison. What started as polite conversation between strangers sharing the same house slowly evolved into something more intense. Ethan remained oblivious, too consumed by his career to notice the growing connection between his wife and son. The mansion, once a symbol of their perfect life, now stood as a silent witness to the secrets that were beginning to unfold inside its walls. By mid-April 2008, the relationship between Nia and Jamison had already taken a dangerous turn. What began as an unexpected attraction soon spiraled into a complex web of manipulation and obsession. Nia, emotionally starved and desperate for connection, quickly became infatuated with Jamison. In her mind, he was the escape she had longed for, the passionate, unpredictable force that could rescue her from the numbness of her marriage to Ethan. But Jameson, having recognized her vulnerability, saw an opportunity to exploit her weaknesses for his own benefit. It was during the week of April 21st, 2008, when Nia first realized that something had shifted. Jameson had begun spending more time out of the house, often leaving without explanation. His absence left Nia restless, her mind swirling with thoughts of him. She found herself constantly checking her phone, waiting for a message or a call that never came. When he was around, his once playful flirtations were replaced with distance and coldness. He avoided her gaze, kept conversations short, and no longer lingered in the quiet corners of the house where they used to share whispered secrets. For Nia, the shift was unbearable. Jameson, meanwhile, had begun to see the situation with increasing clarity. At 23, he was no stranger to difficult relationships, having struggled through his own turbulent past. His time in the Army had taught him how to navigate complicated dynamics, and he saw Nia's infatuation for what it truly was, a tool he could use to his advantage. He wasn't driven by affection or loyalty. His motives were far more practical. Jameson saw the financial security that came with his father's wealth and Nia's access to it. Nia, eager to please, began offering him money without a second thought, giving him control over small household purchases and even sharing her credit cards. Jameson accepted these offerings with ease, knowing that each favor deepened her emotional dependency on him. By the first week of May, Nia was fully under Jameson's influence. Her obsession had reached new heights, with every waking thought revolving around him. She began to neglect her responsibilities, canceling social engagements and withdrawing from her friends, who were starting to notice her increasingly erratic behavior. But Nia didn't care. Her world had narrowed to Jameson alone. Yet despite her devotion, she couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something was wrong. On May 5th, 2008, she decided to confront Jameson after noticing his growing distance. That evening, after Ethan had left for a late business meeting, she approached Jameson in the living room. Her voice trembled as she asked him why he had been pulling away. Jameson, seated on the couch with a drink in hand, looked at her with a cool detachment that sent a chill through her. He told her that things were becoming too complicated, that their affair wasn't meant to be anything serious. He didn't need her in the way she needed him. Nia's heart sank. Her mind raced, grasping for reasons, excuses, anything to convince herself that he didn't mean what he was saying. She began to plead with him, telling him that they could figure things out, that she could make his life easier. Her words were desperate, revealing the depths of her emotional unraveling. Jameson, however, remained unmoved. His eyes drifted to the window, ignoring the intensity of her pleas. But beneath Jameson's calm exterior was growing unease. He had begun to feel that he'd let things go too far. Nia's desperation was becoming dangerous, and he feared that her obsession could ruin everything. More troubling was the fact that his own past, the secrets he had buried during his time in the Army, were at risk of surfacing. He had skeletons in his closet that couldn't withstand scrutiny, and the more entangled he became with Nia, the more likely it was that someone would start digging into his background. His detachment wasn't just an emotional withdrawal, it was a calculated move to distance himself from the chaos he had helped create. By May 10th, Jameson's absences had grown more frequent, and Nia's panic reached new heights. Each time he left the house without a word, she would sit by the window, watching for his return, her stomach in knots. She started to lose sleep, her nights filled with vivid dreams where Jameson was with other women, leaving her behind. During the day, she became increasingly volatile, lashing out at anyone who tried to distract her from her thoughts of him. Her once pristine appearance began to fray, her makeup no longer as perfect, her hair slightly disheveled. It was a visible reflection of her crumbling mental state. On the morning of May 15th, 2008, Nia awoke to find Jameson gone once again. This time he had left no indication of where he was going or when he'd return. Nia's anxiety turned to anger. She began to search his belongings, rifling through his room, trying to find any sign of where he might be or who he might be with. In the bottom drawer of his dresser, she found an old journal from his time in the Army. Flipping through the pages, she discovered entries that hinted at violent encounters, dark thoughts, and unresolved trauma. It was a side of Jameson she had never seen before, and it terrified her. Yet instead of pushing her away, the discovery only deepened her obsession. In her mind, she believed that she could save him, that her love could heal the darkness within him. But Jameson had already made up his mind. He needed to escape before things spiraled further out of control. What he didn't realize was that Nia was already beyond saving. Her obsession had taken hold, and she wasn't going to let go that easily. By mid-May 2008, Nia's growing obsession with Jameson took a darker turn as she began to uncover fragments of his past that terrified her. It was the evening of May 18th when Nia, still overwhelmed by Jameson's sudden coldness, decided to delve deeper into his life. She had already found his journal the week prior, which hinted at violent episodes during his military service. Now she was determined to piece together the parts of him that he had so carefully concealed. What she would soon discover would shake her to her core. Jameson had always been an enigma. Although he didn't speak much about his time in the army, it was clear that those years had changed him. Nia noticed it in the way he moved, sometimes cautiously, as if always on edge, and in the way his eyes would darken whenever the topic of his service was brought up. On the surface, Jameson had returned home as a decorated soldier, but his restless behavior and the journal entries revealed that the reality of his time away was far more sinister. As Nia scoured his belongings on May 18th, she found something far more alarming than his journal. Hidden beneath a pile of old clothes in a duffel bag was a bundle of documents, military reports, and photographs that hinted at a disturbing truth. These papers were not just routine military records. They detailed an investigation into a serious incident that occurred during Jameson's deployment in 2006. The report mentioned an unauthorized raid that resulted in civilian casualties, an event that had been quietly swept under the rug by higher-ups. Jameson's name was not directly implicated in the final report, but the details suggested he had been present during the incident. Nia's hands trembled as she went through the documents, reading about the fallout from the raid. Jameson's unit had faced disciplinary action, but due to the delicate nature of the mission, the details were suppressed, and the men involved were quietly discharged or reassigned. It was clear why Jameson never spoke of his service. It was tainted by violence and secrecy. What Nia found more troubling was the sense that this darkness had followed him home. The Jameson she had fallen for was far more dangerous than she had realized, and yet, rather than pulling away, her obsession only deepened. She felt an irrational need to protect him, to believe that her love could save him from the demons of his past. While Nia was consumed by these revelations, Ethan was playing a different game. He had long suspected that something was going on between his wife and his son. Ethan, a man who thrived on control, had noticed the subtle shifts in Nia's behavior, the way her eyes lingered on Jameson a little too long, the way she seemed to come alive when his son entered the room. It hadn't taken him long to connect the dots, but instead of confronting Nia or Jameson, Ethan chose silence. His silence, however, was not born out of ignorance or apathy. It was a calculated decision. Ethan had always been the master of quiet control. As a high-powered attorney, he understood the value of timing and leverage. By staying quiet, Ethan could observe, gather information, and eventually use it to his advantage. On the surface, he maintained the facade of the overworked, emotionally distant husband, but behind the scenes, he was carefully watching Nia and Jameson, waiting for the right moment to act. Ethan's ability to remain composed despite knowing that his wife was entangled in an affair was a testament to his cold and strategic nature. He knew that his power over Nia would only grow stronger the more she became emotionally dependent on Jameson, and that was exactly what he needed to maintain control. By late May, Ethan's suspicions had evolved into certainty. On the night of May 22nd, he returned home early from a business meeting, entering the house quietly, intending to surprise Nia. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. Nia and Jameson were in the living room, their body language unmistakable. Ethan stood silently in the shadows, watching for a moment, before slipping back out the door without being noticed. It wasn't anger that filled him in that moment, but cold satisfaction. Now he had the evidence he needed. Ethan's plan became clear in the following days. He wouldn't confront them. There was no need. Instead, he began subtly exerting pressure on Nia. He increased his workload, leaving her alone more frequently, forcing her to lean on Jameson even more. But he also made sure to drop subtle hints, small comments that suggested he knew more than he let on, keeping Nia on edge. These psychological games were meant to make her question her own sanity, to make her feel the walls closing in without him ever having to directly accuse her. While Ethan worked in the background, Jameson remained unaware of the extent to which his father knew about the affair. He, too, was growing more paranoid, though for different reasons. On May 28th, Jameson received a phone call from an old military acquaintance, a man he hadn't spoken to in over a year. The call was brief, but the message was clear. Someone was asking questions about the 2006 incident. Jameson's dark past, which he had tried so hard to escape, was catching up to him. Panic set in. He couldn't afford to let anyone, especially his father, find out the truth about his involvement in that raid. The tension in the Carter household was palpable as May came to an end. Nia was spiraling, torn between her obsessive love for Jameson and the growing sense that she was losing control. Ethan, cold and calculating, continued to play his game, pushing Nia further into isolation, while Jameson became increasingly paranoid about both his father's suspicions and the resurfacing of his military past. The stage was set for the collapse of this carefully constructed facade of family life, and all three players were heading toward a final confrontation that would forever shatter the illusion of their perfect lives. By early June 2008, Nia Carter's grip on reality had begun to slip. What had started as infatuation had now morphed into full-blown obsession, and with every passing day, her mental state deteriorated. The turning point came on June 3rd, when Nia noticed a change in Jameson's behavior. He was more distant than ever, disappearing for long hours without explanation. When he did return, he no longer seemed interested in their secret affair. He was colder, more withdrawn, and Nia could feel him slipping away. Her suspicions were confirmed when she saw him with another woman for the first time. It was the evening of June 6, 2008. Nia had been sitting in her car, parked a few streets away from the house, waiting for Jameson to return. She had taken to following him, first just on short errands, then for longer stretches, watching where he went and who he met. That night, she watched as Jameson exited a bar downtown, his arm draped casually over the shoulders of a young woman. Nia's heart sank as she watched them laugh and walk to his car together. The jealousy that had been festering inside her now exploded into something darker. That night, Nia sat alone in her bedroom, replaying the image of Jameson with the other woman over and over in her mind. She couldn't believe he was betraying her like this after everything they had shared. The next morning, she confronted him. Her voice was shaky, her hands trembling as she demanded to know who the woman was. Jameson brushed her off, his voice cold and dismissive. He told her that what they had was over, that she needed to move on. Nia, however, couldn't accept it. On June 8th, Nia's behavior became increasingly erratic. She began tailing Jameson every time he left the house, her paranoia fueling her actions. She kept a detailed mental log of his whereabouts, who he was with, and how long he stayed. Every time he met with the woman, Nia felt a searing pain of jealousy coursing through her. She imagined scenarios in her head, what they were doing, what they were saying, and it only deepened her need to keep Jameson close, even if it meant controlling him. Her days blurred together. She stopped caring about her appearance, no longer attending her social events or charity functions. By mid-June, her friends had noticed her absence, but Nia avoided their calls. Her focus was entirely on Jameson. Time seemed to slip away from her. She couldn't tell one day from the next. She would wake up with her mind already racing, obsessed with where Jameson was and what he was doing. When Ethan came home from work, she barely spoke to him. She was living in a different world, a world where nothing mattered except Jameson. June 14, 2008, marked the day when Nia began losing her sense of time and reality altogether. She spent hours sitting in her car, parked outside the coffee shop Jameson frequented. She would see him sitting with the woman, their heads close together, and in those moments, Nia's memory of their own affair would blur with the present. She began to question whether their relationship had ever been real. Had she imagined it all? The vivid memories she had of their time together now seemed distant, almost like a dream. She couldn't tell if what she was remembering had actually happened or if it was a product of her own mind. By June 18th, Nia's paranoia had reached a peak. She was convinced that Jameson was plotting against her, that he was trying to ruin her life by moving on to someone else. She believed that he was lying to her, manipulating her, and that the woman he was seeing was part of some larger plan to betray her. Every time Jameson left the house, Nia felt her mind unraveling a little more. She began hearing voices in her head, whispers that told her Jameson was laughing at her, that he had never loved her. At night, she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts spiraling out of control. On June 22nd, Nia's paranoia took a violent turn. That morning, she noticed Jameson's phone left unattended on the kitchen counter. She seized the opportunity and quickly scrolled through his messages, finding texts from the woman, plans to meet later that night. Her blood boiled as she read through their conversations. Every word felt like a dagger, driving her deeper into her obsession. She couldn't let this continue. Jameson was hers, and she wasn't going to let anyone take him away. That afternoon, Nia followed Jameson and the woman to a secluded park on the outskirts of Charleston. She stayed at a distance, watching them through the trees as they laughed and talked, completely unaware of her presence. The sight of them together ignited something inside her, an uncontrollable rage that she could no longer suppress. She had always been careful, always remained in the shadows, but now she felt the urge to act. As Nia drove home that evening, her mind was a blur of fragmented memories and distorted thoughts. She couldn't distinguish between the past and the present anymore. She felt as though she was trapped in a loop, constantly reliving the moments when she had been closest to Jameson, only to watch him slip away again. Her obsession had consumed her completely, and the line between reality and fantasy had dissolved. By June 24th, Nia had reached a point of no return. She had lost all sense of control, and her actions were now dictated by the overwhelming need to possess Jameson, to make him hers again. The paranoia that had plagued her for weeks had evolved into something far more dangerous. Nia was no longer simply watching Jameson. She was planning her next move, convinced that the only way to end her suffering was to ensure that Jameson could never leave her again. The stage was set for a confrontation, but in Nia's fractured mind, it wasn't just about love anymore. It was about power, control, and the fear of being abandoned by the one person she believed could save her from the emptiness of her life. It was the evening of June 28, 2008, when Nia Carter made the decision that would change everything. She had spent the entire day pacing the halls of the house, her mind racing with thoughts of Jameson. Every moment felt like an eternity, as if time itself had slowed down to torture her. She hadn't seen him all day, and the fear that he was with the other woman gnawed at her insides. That night, she could no longer bear the silence. She had to confront him, to make him understand that they were meant to be together, no matter what. At 9:15 p.m., Nia heard the sound of Jameson's car pulling into the driveway. Her heart raced as she watched him walk toward the garage, his posture casual, as if nothing in the world could disturb him. But for Nia, this was the moment of truth. She followed him into the garage, her footsteps almost silent as she approached him. The cool summer air hung heavy with tension, the sound of crickets faint in the background. Jameson didn't notice her at first, too absorbed in checking his phone. When he finally looked up, surprise flickered across his face. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, his tone indifferent. But Nia wasn't deterred. Her eyes were wide, filled with a desperation that Jameson hadn't seen before. "We need to talk," she said, her voice tight with emotion. Jameson sighed, pocketing his phone and crossing his arms. He knew what this was about, and he was already tired of the conversation before it even began. "Nia, we've been over this," he said firmly. "It's done. It's over." But Nia shook her head, stepping closer. "No, it's not," she insisted. "It can't be over. You can't just walk away from this. Walk away from me." Jameson's expression hardened. "I already have," he replied coldly. "It was just a fling, Nia. You need to move on." Her heart twisted at his words, and for a brief moment, She felt like she couldn't breathe. This wasn't the Jameson she knew, the man who had shared secret moments with her, who had made her feel alive again. In that moment, something inside her broke. She reached out, grabbing his arm, her fingers digging into his skin. "Please," she begged, her voice trembling. "Don't leave me. I need you. We can make this work." Jameson pulled his arm free, his face contorted with frustration. "You're not listening," he snapped. "This was never going to be anything more than it was. I don't love you, Nia. I never did." Those words hit her like a physical blow. Her mind reeled, and in the split second that followed, something deep within her psyche shifted. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and for the first time, she realized that the Nia who stood in front of Jameson was no longer the same woman. Inside her mind, there were now two voices, one pleading for his love, desperate to salvage the relationship, and the other darker, urging her toward violence. As Jameson turned his back on her, walking toward the garage door, the darker part of Nia's psyche took over. In her mind, a voice whispered that if she couldn't have him, no one could. She couldn't let him leave her, couldn't let him walk away as if their time together had meant nothing. Without thinking, Nia's eyes locked onto the workbench in the corner of the garage, where a kitchen knife lay among a set of tools. The next few moments passed in a blur. Her body seemed to move on its own, her hand grasping the knife as she rushed toward Jameson. She could hear the blood pounding in her ears, the world narrowing to a single point. Him. Jameson didn't hear her coming until it was too late. When he turned around, his eyes widened in shock as he saw Nia charging at him, the blade gleaming in the dim garage light. He raised his hands instinctively, but her momentum was unstoppable. The knife plunged into his chest, the force of the blow sending him stumbling backward. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Jameson's eyes were wide with disbelief, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. He gasped, his body convulsing as he clutched at the wound. Blood spilled from between his fingers, dark and thick, staining his shirt. Nia stood there, frozen in place, her hands still gripping the knife. Her mind was a whirlwind of chaos, half of her screaming in horror at what she had done, the other half eerily calm, as if this had been inevitable all along. Jameson staggered backward, collapsing onto the cold concrete floor of the garage. As he lay there gasping for breath, his eyes locked onto Nia's. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of something in his gaze. Fear, confusion, maybe even regret. And then, just like that, the light in his eyes faded. His body went still, the last shuddering breath escaping his lips. It was 9:27 p.m. when Jameson Carter took his final breath. Nia dropped to her knees beside him, staring down at his lifeless form. Her hands were trembling, covered in blood. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I did this because I love you." But even as the words left her lips, Nia knew that love had nothing to do with it anymore. This was something darker, something that had taken control of her long ago. She had lost herself to the obsession, and now it had consumed them both. For the next several minutes, Nia sat there in the garage, numb to the world around her. The weight of what she had done pressed down on her like a crushing force, but her mind refused to fully comprehend it. All she could do was stare at Jameson's body, her breath shallow and uneven. At 9:40 p.m., the silence of the night was broken by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Ethan was home. Nia's heart raced as reality began to crash down around her. What was she going to do? How could she explain this? There was no time to think, no time to plan. She had just murdered the man she claimed to love, and now there was no way back. At 9:45 p.m. on June 28, 2008, Nia Carter stood in the dimly lit garage, her mind a tangled mess of panic and disbelief. Jameson's lifeless body lay crumpled on the cold concrete floor, a pool of blood slowly spreading beneath him. Her hands were still shaking, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the reality of what she had done began to sink in. She had to act quickly. Ethan would be home any minute, and the sight of his dead son sprawled across the floor would unravel everything. In her panic, Nia dragged Jameson's body across the garage floor, leaving a dark, smeared trail of blood behind. He was heavier than she anticipated, and her muscles strained with the effort as she hauled him toward the basement door. The seconds ticked by, her mind racing, trying to think of how to hide him, how to clean up the mess she had made. She couldn't think straight, the rush of adrenaline clouding her thoughts. All she knew was that she needed to make him disappear, if only for a little while, until she could figure out her next move. At 10:05 p.m., Nia managed to drag Jameson's body down the narrow stairs into the dark basement. Her chest burned with exertion, her arms trembling from the effort. The basement, cluttered with old furniture and boxes, felt cold and oppressive. The perfect place to conceal the evidence of her crime, at least for now. She grabbed an old tarp from a pile of dusty tools and covered his body, trying to suppress the rising tide of nausea that threatened to overwhelm her. The smell of blood hung in the air, thick and metallic, making her stomach churn. With shaking hands, Nia set about scrubbing the bloodstains off the garage floor. She grabbed a bucket of water and bleach, frantically scrubbing at the dark streaks of blood. But no matter how hard she worked, the stains seemed to cling to the concrete. Her hands were raw and blistered from the rough scrubbing, her heart pounding in her chest as the minutes ticked by. It felt like an impossible task. No matter how much she cleaned, the evidence of what she had done was still there, stubborn and unyielding. By 10:40 p.m., Nia's panic had reached a fever pitch. She had managed to clean most of the visible blood from the floor, but the smell lingered, seeping into her clothes, her skin. She could still feel Jameson's presence in the house, the weight of his lifeless body heavy in her mind. Her paranoia began to spiral out of control. Every sound, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, made her jump, convinced that someone would walk in at any moment and discover the truth. She couldn't shake the feeling that Jameson was still there, watching her from the basement, his cold eyes staring up through the floorboards. It was around 10:50 p.m. when Ethan's car finally pulled into the driveway. Nia froze, her heart skipping a beat as the sound of the garage door opening echoed through the house. She wiped her hands on her jeans, trying to steady her breathing, but her pulse was racing. She had only just finished hiding the worst of the evidence, but the house still felt tainted, as if the walls themselves held the secret of what she had done. Ethan stepped inside at 10:55 p.m., immediately sensing that something was off. The house was too quiet, too still. He glanced around, his sharp eyes taking in the state of disarray. Nia was sitting in the kitchen, her back rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She barely looked at him as he entered, her eyes darting toward the garage door, where the faintest trace of a bloodstain still lingered. "Where's Jameson?" Ethan asked, his voice calm but edged with suspicion. Nia's heart raced. She could feel the walls closing in around her, her mind scrambling for an answer, but her mouth felt dry, her words stuck in her throat. He went out," she managed to stammer, her voice weak and unconvincing. Ethan's brow furrowed as he looked at her, sensing the lie immediately. There was something in the air, a tension, a heaviness that he couldn't quite place. He stepped toward the door leading to the basement, an odd feeling settling in his gut. Without saying a word, he opened the door and descended the stairs. At 11:05 p.m., Ethan reached the bottom of the stairs and flicked on the basement light. The room was dimly lit by a single bulb, casting long shadows over the cluttered space. His eyes scanned the room, landing on the tarp haphazardly thrown over something large in the corner. His stomach tightened as he stepped closer, his footsteps slow and deliberate. When Ethan pulled back the tarp, the sight of his son's bloodied body greeted him. For a moment he simply stood there, staring down at Jameson's pale face, his shirt soaked with dark, drying blood. There was no shock on Ethan's face, no sudden outburst of grief or rage. Instead, his expression remained eerily calm, as if he had anticipated this all along. At 11:15 p.m., Ethan returned upstairs, his face impassive as he reached for the phone. He dialed 911, his voice steady as he informed the operator that there had been a murder in his home. "My son," he said flatly. "He's dead. My wife. She killed him." There was no trace of emotion in his voice as he gave the address and hung up the phone. His reaction was cold, almost mechanical, as if he had been expecting this moment all along. As the sound of approaching sirens began to fill the night air, Ethan sat down at the kitchen table across from Nia. He didn't say a word to her. He didn't need to. The damage had already been done, and he knew exactly how to play his part. At 11:30 p.m. on June 28, 2008, the flashing blue and red lights of police cruisers illuminated the quiet street in front of the Carter household. Officers quickly surrounded the house, moving with precision as they entered the home, responding to Ethan's calm 911 call. Inside, the scene was chilling. Nia sat frozen at the kitchen table, her eyes wide with fear, while Ethan stood nearby, his expression devoid of emotion. It was as though the chaos and bloodshed of the night hadn't touched him at all. As the officers approached Nia, they asked her what had happened. Her words stumbled out in fragmented sentences, barely coherent. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she kept repeating, her hands trembling uncontrollably. She spoke of love, of desperation, of things that no longer made sense even to her. The reality of Jamison's death still hadn't fully sunk in, but the police didn't need her confession. They had the body downstairs in a house filled with evidence. At 11:50 p.m., Nia was handcuffed and led out of the house. She didn't resist. There was no fight left in her. As the police escorted her to the waiting squad car, she caught a glimpse of Ethan standing in the doorway. His face was a mask of calm, his arms crossed as he watched her being taken away. There was something unsettling about the way he looked at her, detached, almost triumphant. What Nia didn't know in that moment was that Ethan had orchestrated this entire situation. Over the previous months, he had watched as her mental state deteriorated as she became more and more obsessed with Jamison. Ethan knew about the affair long before she ever suspected. He saw it as an opportunity, not a threat. Nia's instability was something he could use, and he had done exactly that. In the days leading up to Jamison's death, Ethan had subtly pushed Nia further toward the edge. He would drop hints, suggest that Jamison wasn't loyal to her, and feed her paranoia. When she became agitated, he would remain calm, pushing her just enough to deepen her emotional spiral. Ethan had anticipated this outcome. He wanted Nia to snap, to make the fatal mistake that would allow him to wash his hands of both her and Jamison, while maintaining his own innocence. At 12:30 a.m., as Nia was processed at the local police station, Ethan was already thinking ahead. He knew the investigation would focus on Nia's deteriorating mental state and her affair with Jamison. What no one would suspect was his role as the quiet manipulator behind the scenes. He had covered his tracks well, never directly involving himself in the affair, always playing the part of the distant, hard-working husband. As the police questioned Nia, her mental state became their primary focus. She was visibly distraught, her words often incoherent, switching between declarations of love for Jamison and outbursts of anger and confusion. The officers noted her erratic behavior, her eyes darting nervously around the room as though she couldn't trust her own thoughts. It was clear to them that Nia's mental health would be a central issue in the case. The trial began on November 3, 2008. The courtroom was packed with reporters, local residents, and onlookers who had followed the sensational case. Nia Carter, now a shadow of the woman she once was, sat at the defense table, her hands trembling as she stared blankly ahead. Her defense team had already prepared a strategy focused on her fragile mental state, highlighting her obsessive behavior and the signs of a personality disorder that had gone untreated for years. But this wasn't just a story of mental illness. It was a story of manipulation, betrayal, and murder. Over the course of the trial, which lasted until mid-December, the prosecution painted Nia as a dangerously unstable woman who had lost touch with reality. They presented evidence of her affair with Jamison and detailed how her obsession had driven her to commit murder. The prosecutors brought forth text messages, journal entries, and even testimonies from neighbors who had noticed Nia's increasingly erratic behavior in the weeks leading up to Jamison's death. But as the trial unfolded, darker details about the Carter family began to surface. The defense introduced evidence that suggested Ethan had played a far more significant role in Nia's mental unraveling than anyone had realized. Witnesses testified that Ethan had been distant, emotionally manipulative, and even coldly indifferent to Nia's deteriorating condition. They claimed that Ethan had known about the affair for months but had chosen to remain silent, using Nia's instability to his advantage.